War is one of those phenomena that distills the nature of life down to its most pure and naked forms. Life is, at base, an arena of competing wills, chaos, and truth revealed by action. All power comes from the coercive force of organized violence. In a word, its essence is martial. The defining delineator between the aristocrat and the slave is attitude towards life. Salvete legionaries! I am joined by our honored legate, Lance Legion, and today we have a very special show for you. We are going to be discussing his book, Caesar Bellator, which came out in, I believe, was it February or March of last year, or this year actually. It's still 2024, though the new year is coming upon us with many more auspicious campaigns that we shall embark on. But Caesar Bellator came out earlier this year. It recounts the campaigns of the great Julius Caesar in Gaul and a little bit in Britannia as well. And I have the pleasure of being able to interview Lance Legion today on what went into writing this book and clarifying some of his profound messages within this writing, which I think in my review that I wrote about it, I said every young military man should read this book. And every one of you legionaries, as prospective military men, whether you are serving now, served in the past, plan to serve in the future, or will serve as a civilian warrior in Civilian Division 1, you should read this book, and this video will be a nice introduction into this piece of writing. So anyway, thank you for joining me, Lance, and maybe if you could just talk about what went into writing this book, what gave you the inspiration to start writing this book, and we'll just go from there.
Well, friends, Romans, countrymen, it's good to be here. I appreciate being back on. I guess it comes from a bunch of different things, right? I've always been obsessed with Rome. Maybe you couldn't tell, but ever since I was a little kid, it was one of those. It was my first book I picked up. It was one of those DK series where it was ancient Rome, and I was absolutely enamored with the example of the legions, with Caesar, with Rome itself, and effectively my love kind of, I guess, evolved from that, right? But then it expanded into just generally military arts and sciences in general, and of course, as you study that, as you become a warrior, as you hone the soul and the body and the mind of a warrior, you look into history. You look into military history, you look into personal history, biography, and a staple of my consumption has always been the classical world. And no one has figured more prominently than Caesar himself. But why? Why is that so important to me? Because ultimately, Caesar, when he was conquering Gaul, he was the only one that was writing in a very, first of all, prolific way, and second of all, in an accurate, or, for the time, an accurate way, clear, concise, well-spoken Latin, that kind of engaged with the leadership, with the tactics, with the environment, with the people, the sociological, the psychological aspects of campaigning, of military life, and so on, and discipline. And ultimately, for me, I mean, when I was reading as a kid, it's basically the Gallic Wars and then the Civil Wars by Caesar. I thought it was incredibly interesting. However, and this was originally the Penguin series, so it was just the script. And for me, I could imagine it in my mind. I could think about it. And but the challenge with the classics is that the classics are written in a way that's just not engaging, right? A lot of modern, I guess, readers, when they read many of the classics, especially for something that was translated in the 1900s, early 1900s, it can be a little bit, I don't know, a little bit of a kind of a veil, because they don't see what I see. They don't understand why it is that I have such a passion for it. And so what I decided to do is to take this as an opportunity to do three different things. One is to rewrite the events, to talk about the exact Gallic Wars, the Gallic campaigns, in a modern way. Two, to show the legionaries or those prospective leaders not necessarily what to think, right? I'm not trying to teach them what it is they should deduce from reading the script or the text, but rather how they should be thinking when they're analyzing historical models or case studies, because this extends as a tool for leadership and for, I guess, what I would say is a war fighter's ability to understand the past, to come up with conceptual complexes in their mind, to apply it to future endeavors, right? And so the idea is to teach the individual legionary how to think about tactical, operational, and strategic and political outcomes of a campaign by observing something that's very simple. And third is to imbibe the spirit. Now, Nietzsche obviously is one of my favorite philosophers, but when he talks about history, he talks about history in such a way which explains that there are three different types, right? There's antiquarian, there's vitalistic, or rather monumental history, and then there's critical history, right? And so antiquarian is basically this conventional or rather conservative view of history. It's about preserving the past. And then critical history, I'm sure many of you know through your experience abroad and simply being in the West around these commies, it's about basically assassinating the past. And now this is not a bad thing per se, right? Being critical of history is allowing us to forget things so that way we're able to evolve. However, they're trying to kill things which are good for us and remember things which are bad for us. And what my project is, again, especially when I write history, when I talk about history, most importantly is about imbibing that will to power, that will to spirit. That is the fundament of every warrior since time eternal. And ultimately, that is what Caesar Bellator at core is supposed to be. I want you to read it and feel like you ripped a line of meth into your schnoz and you just absolutely take the fight to the enemy, and you use the practical skills or the practical tools, which are pretty ubiquitous, coupled with that spirit, so that way you're able to thrust yourself into the future and conquer your own goal and conquer your own enemies, much in the same way Caesar had. I hope that's kind of, I guess, a good background as to why my motivations were to write Caesar Bellator, Warrior. I'm sure forgive me if I'm a little bit long-winded. It's something of a passion of mine.
Of course. And I think that when I was reading it, it reminded me of reading MCDP Warfighting. Back in MCT, I got a stomach virus or something from eating crab right before I went to MCT. You know, don't eat questionable seafood before you had to go back into training. But I ended up really sick, and I got 24-hour bed rest, which was pretty nice considering it was MCT. But I had a lot of time on my hands, obviously. So besides missing home and all that lame stuff, I also decided to read MCDP Warfighting. And it reminded me a lot about it because they also have a lot of case studies that go into specific events and sort of deduce the message or the lesson to be learned from that. So that's why when I wrote my review of this book, I said this is something for the young military man, because it gets very straight to the point. There's no fluffing up of the history. It goes straight to what do we need to know about this specific battle? What do we learn from it?
Yes.
And it keeps you moving forward, which I like. It's a very short book, so that's why another reason I think every young man should read this, because there's no excuse not to, right? It's not like reading Livy's History of Rome, which will take you, 80 hours. It's very, very concise and right into it. So I definitely recommend it. And before I go into some passages that I would like to read for the legionaries, if you wouldn't mind, we were speaking a while ago about the deep spiritual experience it was to visit the same lands that Caesar conquered, that Caesar and his legion shed blood on. I really liked what you had to say about that when we spoke. So if you wouldn't mind, before we get into the book, just briefly telling the legionaries about your experience.
Absolutely. And just a quick callback though, MCDP 1 is an absolute must read, and then you follow that up with MCDP 1 TAC 3 Tactics. and absolutely was a inspiration for how I wanted to write, because I think ultimately military men, we want to get at the core of a problem, the jugular of the problem, as quickly as possible. You have to be concise, simple, and forceful, right? And ultimately, there's a lot of historical writing, unfortunately, that is very winding and talking about this and that and the other thing. I don't like that. I want you to get straight to the point, to learn what's necessary, and to imbibe the spirit. And I'm glad that you say that, because it's exactly what I was going for. Read MCDP 1, please. But going further, one of kind of the, I guess, almost molding times or periods of my life was when I had actually gone to Alesia. And for those of you who don't know, Alesia is ultimately the site in which Caesar had the culminating victory over the Gauls. Total victory, right? And it was alleged that roughly 400 to 500,000 Gauls were fighting his entrenched 100,000 legionaries at Alesia. And Alesia is where Vercingetorix, the leader of all the Gauls who came from the tribe of the Averni, was ultimately holed up and waiting for relief. But this was the site of Caesar's ultimate victory, right? Because it's not simply a tactical miracle, but it was a tactical and a scientific work of art. And what do I mean by that? Well, first of all, Caesar did something that was unknown beforehand, especially in Roman history and in classical history. But excuse me, I can't even say it. Circumvallation, which is basically making a siege line that completely encircles this hill fort at Alesia. And then, of course, another one, which is the contra circumvallation, which is the one that faced outwards. So roughly 40 miles of ramparts were built by hand by these legionaries to both, first of all, siege Vercingetorix in the castle on a hilltop in Alesia, and it's beautiful, warrior. You should see it. It's basically placed on this grassy plain, and then finally jutting out of the earth in the French countryside is this big rocky hill, and on top of it would rest where this fortress, this Gallic fortress, had been before. And everything below them, you could see the countryside for miles and miles and miles, just a blessed land, Helios himself blessing it with sunlight and barley waves. It almost looks like that Gladiator movie excerpt where the guy's walking in the grassy plains next to his manor and so on. It looks like that, but more martial. Anyway, point being is that ultimately it was the apotheosis of Caesar. It was the culmination of multiple years of campaigning throughout Gaul, but ultimately it was his triumph over Vercingetorix and his minting as the ultimate Roman, the Roman with a future, a future that was still to be birthed, right? And ultimately, when I was a kid, I remember driving with my dad in the countryside, and we were just going through Europe in general. And I remember seeing in French Alesia, and I was like, oh my God, oh my God. And it's this tiny little sign on the side of the road in the middle of nowhere in the Occitan, countryside. And for whatever reason, I felt like it was almost like my spirit was tethered and it was pulling me in this direction. And so I had to go there. I had to go there. I was almost desperate. And I remember summiting the hill climb, which is actually pretty steep. It's a kind of a hump to get up. But you get to the top of this hill fort, and it is almost like I could feel as if I were in Caesar's Caligae right there. I saw what he saw. I was there. 2,000 years ago, I was there. So ultimately, it's been a source of inspiration for me. And I know that General Patton himself, when he was on the northern plains of Africa, he said that he was previously a centurion in the Punic Wars. And I believe that too. I saw him there too. So it's esoteric knowledge. I can't get into it too deep. But anyway, Warrior, why don't you go ahead and take it away?
Absolutely. And though I haven't been to any Roman ruins in France, I did get to go to Mont Saint Michel. That was a very cool experience, especially I loved Lord of the Rings as a kid. And of course, Mont Saint Michel is the inspiration for Minas Tirith. So a lot of great history in Europe and specifically France, especially because the stone, right? The stone holds some sort of latent energy from the past, and when you touch the stone, you absorb a bit
Yes.
of it. I'm sure you can relate. But
Yes.
I wanted to begin looking into this book with reading one passage from your introduction, which I really liked, because ultimately, what I really loved about this book, apart from the history, was when you sort of inserted your own philosophical positions within it, and of course, many of them are basically shaped through these quotes from Nietzsche, and then you sort of elaborate on them, and you have some very good quotable lines here, which hopefully in the future, once more people read Caesar Bellator, instead of just seeing Nietzsche quote posts with naked women, Greek statues, and formations, we'll see Caesar Bellator quotes. But I'll
Epic.
read this line here from the introduction, which I really liked. And it is, all power comes from the coercive force of organized violence. In a word, its essence is martial. The defining delineator between the aristocrat and the slave is attitude towards life. The former values valor in combat above all things which, in comparison, seem frivolous and pale. The spiritual aristocrat and values the honor of arms beyond even his life. The latter values the mere possibility of existing and values it above all things. The former will never suffer dishonor in the form of begging for the scraps of a cold and pallid life. Caesar was a great man, first because he valued great exploits and honor, which served as an engine for his rise. The profession of arms was his next step towards greatness, and it will be yours too. And it reminds me of that line from the play Julius Caesar, which is probably my favorite play by Shakespeare. That and Romeo and Juliet, of course, because I am a great romantic myself. But
Real.
there was the line where, and I'm paraphrasing here, but Caesar in the play says something along the lines of, a coward dies 1,000 times before his death. The courageous man dies but once. And he was saying this in response to, I believe, his wife warning him of a dream she had where he would essentially be assassinated, and that's exactly what happened. But what Caesar is saying is that essentially life's value is not in longevity, it is not in comfort, and it is not in just the mere living of life, but living valiantly and greatly, and living dangerously, in fact. And there's a biological reality which has the necessity of danger and risk and discomfort and pain to live a good life. I mean, this is even true today to some extent, though it's been highly diluted, right? Even in the business world, you do have to
Right.
work hard, but it's not like the past. In the past, there was a very real physical relationship with success, which I really love. And I think you capture that greatly with this quote. And I have more that I want to go into, of course, but I thought that was a very good introduction to what essentially the life of Caesar represents, or ought to represent, especially to us legionaries. But before I go on, is there anything you have to say regarding that specifically?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think the reason why I started it off is because ultimately, especially if you've been in the military, I was in the Marine Corps and I had experience. I come from a military family, and I'm sure that many of you who are listening have as well, or if you experienced it by proxy, or even if you're a civilian, the quality of life, they say it's been increasing, but I think it's been decreasing. And the reason why is that ultimately the thing which makes life are the opposites. So ultimately the bow, the tension of your soul is bent by ultimately pain. And this is why I talk about run towards pain and the subsequent euphoria of the opposite end. So think of it like a sine wave, right? And ultimately, people, especially moderns, well, it's not even a modern, it's a perennial issue. It's a universal issue throughout time, right? And that the slave and the Romans encapsulated this perfectly. And this is why they, quote unquote, mistreated the slaves, is because ultimately the slave chose life, existence as a worm, as opposed to being a man. And so if you choose to see how Romans truly are, they choose death. For instance, Cato, who was one of the enemies of Cato the Younger, who was one of the enemies of Caesar, who was ultimately defeated after Zama, chose not to relent, chose not to surrender himself to who he saw as a tyrant and who he saw as to be his mortal enemy, and killed himself. And some people think suicide is cowardly. I think what is cowardly is slavery, because especially the way Cato did it, not only did he stab himself and his friends stitched him up, ultimately when he was alone, he ultimately ripped his abdomen open with his fingers and disemboweled himself with his own hands. And ultimately, that is the vital force that I'm trying to impart upon you who are listening, is that belief and passion in this life is about living life with strength, with purpose, with vitality and fullness. And that doesn't come from being afraid. It doesn't come from seeking material comforts. It doesn't come from doing drugs. It doesn't come from doing all these things. Though I'm not saying that you can't do these things, you can't enjoy these things. I'm saying that it's incidental. The driver of life is greatness and purpose and the will to power. It's ultimately your central axis. And it's why military men are ultimately the ones who, birth creations onto the world, right? It's because it's, in fact, the first states were birthed by war bands, brotherhoods in arms, who effectively took over a piece of a region and took over the women and the effeminate men, who are basically castrates, and made them into a nation state or a city state, whatever you have. So think, for instance, Romulus and the rape of the Sabians and the cucks that were the Sabians, right? And so ultimately, what I'm trying to teach you, Legionary, is that courage is the first step into achieving what it is that you want from life, which is to say the fullness of life, which is to live as a master or to live as nothing at all. Because to live as a slave is to die every day. And I'm glad that Warrior brought that up, because that too was one of my greatest, and continues to be one of my greatest maxims. Some people call me reckless. So be it. I'd rather be reckless than craven, especially if the choice is between a tepid middle ground or being headlong into my own doom. Like the Charge of the Light Brigade, people remember the Charge of the Light Brigade. They don't remember the countless billions of human cockroaches who live out there, So I'm glad that you brought it up, Warrior, because it truly comes at the core of what I'm trying to teach, that spirit of courage, of not being here for a long time, but for a damn good time, if that makes sense.
It's worth noting as well that the Charge of the Light Brigade was successful. They did take the Russian artillery position, so
exactly,
that's got to count for something, don't you think? But going off of that, since we are kind of delineating the master and the slave, so to speak, I think that the next thing I want to bring up from your book is what you had to say about many of the Celtic peoples and what made them a warlike people. It reminded me a lot of selective breeding, actually, in The Birth of Philosophy, or was it Bronze Age Mindset? I sort of fused the two together in my brain, so I hardly know which one I'm talking about. But it was one
people.
of those.
They're two different people.
Exactly, of course. But anyway, it goes back to the whole what makes a people noble, or what makes them martial, what makes them greater. And I think you hit the nail on the head with this one analysis. It's in, I believe it's chapter 3, and you're talking about the Celtic peoples. And I'll just read this quote out. It is often the case that hard environments make a martial and disciplined people. The reason behind this is because the exigencies of life are so much more difficult for the day-to-day than it is for the inhabitants of lush and rich environments, where both the weather, the earth, and the security from violence is comparatively less. The mountains are an environment where those that live must be both strong and resilient to the colds and the lack of arable land. A martial quality is imparted by the constant warring between different tribes and confederations, constantly encroaching on each other to seize their respective resources. The only way for people who do not live in a naturally challenging environment to become tough and regimented is through the artificial imposition of hardship and discipline from above. The shock of the coming battles between the Romans and the Celts will show how learned and self-enforced discipline is often superior to the hardness imparted by environmental circumstances. And I really love this quote, because one of the things early on in my philosophical journey that I started talking about was simulated suffering, was that in a modern world of abundance, you have to simulate suffering. And that's exactly what you're talking about here in regards to the Romans, and how if you do it correctly, you can actually create an even stronger force from this artificial simulation than the natural simulation, which I think is really interesting and pertinent considering the modern struggles of the American military is that we have a largely castrated military force fighting against men who see paradise in the barrel of a rifle, to paraphrase the quote from that Soviet general talking about the Afghans, right? We're fighting, or at least during GWAT, we fought an enemy that had no fear and that was shaped by their environment, specifically the Taliban, right? These are hardy peoples. These are people exactly very similar, at least, to how you describe the Celts. And of course, we ended up losing
Right.
for various reasons. But if we simulate suffering properly, which has been the case, and which is the case with the Romans, and to a large extent, many peoples take the Spartans, for instance, right? It's the exact same thing. The agoge is a simulation of suffering, right? Of course, the Dorians come from people that are very similar to the Celts in the sense that those peoples, their ethnic background is that of hardship from the land. But when they came down to I'm trying to remember the name of Laconia, right? That's the region, I believe.
Yes.
Once they came down to that region, obviously now they rely on the Helots for their subsistence. Life is quote unquote easy from a natural perspective, so they have to impart the simulated suffering, which is really, really great. And maybe, before we move on, if you have any thoughts about that particular quote.
Yeah, so one of the greatest challenges that I've been trying to teach people, and it's because the human animal is a coward, okay? The human animal is a coward. It seeks sleep, it seeks plenty, it seeks laziness. It basically wants an easy life, and the majority of people, especially usually Christians and liberals and people who dwell in the suburb, which whether it's the petit bourgeoisie or whatever it may be, they seek an easy life and they just want it easy. And so what that means is that ultimately they become weaker. We atrophy. And I mean, I'm not saying this from simply a, I guess, I'm not. It's not conjecture. It's a scientific basis of this occurrence. What we call decadence is ultimately two things. It is the atrophying of this thing called the midcingulate cortex, which is ultimately the source of willpower in your biological body. And by the way, there is no daylight between your body and your soul. They're one and the same thing. So ultimately, if your body's messed up, your soul is messed up. Homer knew this. This is why if you die a certain way, it's how you were represented in Hades. But anyway, getting back here is also this other concept, which is psychological tension. Animals in general, they need adversity. They need it. It's not just me being a hard ass or me trying to be a BDSM advocate for your life. I'm telling you this because ultimately there's this very well-known, almost Reddit tier study of, as far as how popular and cliche it's become, but it's called societal slip or societal sink, or no, sorry, yeah, societal sink. And what it is basically the utopia of rats. And these rats have everything they want. They have pussy, they have grain, they have a nice little cozy hole to sleep in. And people would think that under those conditions, those mammals, they would ultimately thrive, but they didn't. And it was actually pretty disturbing because listen to how it ended up. It's ultimately over time, these rats became antisocial. They refused to go out into the meta space and convene with each other. They created almost incel types. They created like little female rats who couldn't really even bring to term their children, and even when they did, they lost the nurturing instinct required to nurture their children up to health and raise them. And that ultimately, over generations, this mouse utopia dwindled to fewer and fewer, from 1,000 all the way down to one or two. And the most disturbing thing is that researchers did this hundreds of times, by the way, and at the end, they would try and mate the survivors of that utopia with the survivors of another utopia, and ultimately they would die. They would die, okay? But this is the implication. The implication is that your soul, it's not enough to have things. Your soul wasn't meant to be living in plenty. Your soul wasn't meant to be living in ease. Your soul was meant for a mission and the adversity in that striving to attain it. Why? Because it's something you need more than food. It's something you need more than sex. It's something that you need more than what you think you need. You need adversity. And at the end of the day, the manna of life comes from pain. Pain is the first impulse. It is actually neurocognitively the first thing to have evolved in our spinal cord as mammals or even lizards. Even, for instance, pain recognition, this is what ultimately the neurons are required or best adapted to essentially censor, right? It's not euphoria, it's not pleasure, it's actually pain. Pain is what kept you from killing yourself, kept you from dying effectively. And ultimately, the greatest boon your brain can take is pain. The greatest thing that can happen for you is pain, especially if you interpret it in such a way that helps you as opposed to hinders you. And so, to bring it full circle and to talk about, I think, I guess it maybe it was the Celts, but I thought it was the Germans specifically. But this idea in which they were placed in an environment, in a natural environment, which was trying, which was cold, which was hard, and in resources, which required diligence and effort and training. It's not simply war against people, but a war against others, wars against yourself. And the Germans were famous for keeping themselves from copulating all the time, because of that dopamine spike you get from sex, by women keeping the flaps of their tents open. So that way, first of all, they wouldn't cheat, and two, they wouldn't basically be banging all the time. And German women would only couple with German men or German warriors after a successful battle. And so ultimately, you have to remember that nature hates weakness. It hates weakness, and the core form of weakness is that longing for peace, that longing for plenty, that longing for ease. And if you kill that slave in your head, you can do great things. This life wasn't about being comfortable. This life is about pain. So run towards pain. And that's what I tell you there as far as how to fight not simply the decadence outside, which is showing the way for our wider civilization, but it starts with you, Legionary. It starts within. It starts with the challenges that you take and the risks that you face and the adversity that you overcome. That is the meaning of life. Be damned all your gold and your silver and those petty. In fact, it's not even that. Most of you sell your souls out for not even 30 pieces of silver. It's for TV time. It's for sleeping in late. It's for those petty and small passions that you have, which are weak and pathetic and made you weak and pathetic. I'm here to show you ways of strength. And that's ultimately shown by people who lived that way. Germans, first of all, but the Spartans are probably the most salient for you and I, because the Spartans also lived, comparatively speaking, in a civilized society. They lived, obviously, with agricultural plenty. They had the food necessary to survive. They had, skilled artisans. Remember that before Lycurgus, it was just like any other city-state. It had plenty of riches and wealth, and that ultimately what made them the preeminent city-state in the entire, first of all, Hellenic world, the oikoumene, was their self-imposed discipline, their self-imposed pain, and that purpose that came from that. And remember the other thing, and I'm glad that you brought up Dr. Alamario, but he talks about the birth of philosophy. And that ultimately people like Plato and Socrates, they're not the descendants of willy-nilly, no-chinned, pathetic soy faces, right? At the end of the day, these men are warriors, and your body needs to be physically strong for your soul to be physically strong. And the way that your body becomes physically strong is by physical exercise, by, I would even hazard to say, combat yourself. And it is from that hardware, are you able to create things of beauty. And this is why Warrior and I, we synergize so much. And I think maybe you might get sick of me for being on here so many times, but I would like to say is that this is the crux of our philosophy, is that ultimately you want to see a beautiful world, but you yourself are not beautiful. And I mean that in a practical sense. You don't even have the discipline to physically lift, you legionaries who are out there not lifting enough, or not running enough, or not pushing your body, or not seeking out adversity. Being a coward, whether it's moral or physical, is killing you. You should see the death that comes from battle to be noble, and to see the death that comes from cowardice, which happens every day when you lay your head on that mattress and you know you could have given it all. You know that you could have, risked the fates and made them sing. Ultimately, that's on you. And I'm here to teach you how to conquer yourself. So anyway, I hope that's not too far off center, Warrior. I apologize for that. I get passion. I get lost in the fury, you know?
No worries. And before I move on from that topic, I think chapter 13 describes exactly what you just talked about. In fact, you talk about both the Dorians or the Spartans in relation to the Suebi. Is that how do you say that? The Suebi.
I think it's the Suebi. I think a lot of
Okay,
these
cool.
ancient words are just as they sound, you know?
Perfect. Yeah, and I'll just read a quote there before I move on. You said, "The way of life the Suebi lead should call to mind the habits of the Dorians, or specifically the Spartans. Both were of a similar origin, Hyperborea, and both were known for their ruthless discipline and their warriors' contempt for material riches. To many, including the ancient Romans like Tacitus, these Northmen were a focus of admiration, austere, hardy, free, and wild. The Germans were that many Romans saw their ancestors, or what many Romans saw their ancestors to be. That is, the Romans perceived the Suebi to be a great people who were uncorrupted and vital." And so it's interesting, right? Because we were just talking about the Spartans and the Germans in relation to each other, and of course one of the hallmarks here. And then you say in another line talking about Lycurgus, who you just mentioned earlier, Lycurgus sought to encourage the Spartan man to seek wealth in valor and virtue, not in the effeminate desire for material possessions nor the comfort that they confer. It was this very discipline that made the Suebi a fierce and powerful people, and the very reason why they arose as a major contender for power in the Roman arena. And of course, the cyclical view of history is always that the hardy martial peoples sort of enslave and establish themselves in the top of the hierarchy over the sedentary peoples. This repeats itself many times throughout history, all the way to the Mongols, right, which is like 1300s. Like this is pretty recent when you really think about it in the scope of human history. Let's say human history starts with agricultural revolution, really. So that's like nearly 10,000 years of this phenomena. So that's pretty interesting. And of course, the reason I bring that up specifically and going forward is what makes worthy a people. And of course, it is this martial ability. And I think this is a perfect segue into another thing that you mentioned, which I want to briefly talk about. And it's in chapter 14, which is the chapter right after the one I just mentioned. And it is, war is always an extension of the political. And there is a fantastic quote by one of our mortal enemies, Mao Zedong, who, despite being a commie bastard, has very many lessons to impart onto us, which we should listen. Of course, he was a student of Sun Tzu and many other. The thing with Chinese philosophy is it is largely unchanged since the Warring States period, which is really interesting. Their philosophy has been codified literally over thousands of years, and even today's PRC is largely the same. But when you say war is always an extension of the political, this is precisely the same thing that Mao Zedong says, where he says, politics is war without bloodshed, and war is politics with bloodshed. Ultimately, politics is a farce because it is all dependent upon this non-aggression principle, which is supposed to be on the premise that being diplomatic and your diplomatic power, right, will take precedence over your power of arms or violence, right? This is the idea behind democracy. But in reality, what gives you legitimacy is always power. So the reason why we're not killing each other, or why we're not having a civil war, is supposed to be, or not even supposed to be, is in reality, the biological reality is supposed to be that, well, the other side and your side is generally equal in force of arms, therefore you act diplomatically. But of course, this is not the case today, right? There's clearly one side which would overrun the other side with ease, right? So it's this very unnatural sort of thing. And I think that you hit the nail on the head there, where war is an extension of the political. You can't detach the two. Spengler talks about this in Man and Technics, essentially pulling together all the different facets of the state as one, which ultimately is expressed through martial ability. That's what a state is. Sun Tzu talks about this as well. And what you specifically meant with this introduction to your chapter was Caesar using war as a political tool. In fact, I believe there was a negotiation. I believe it was Caesar. There was a negotiation between Caesar and the Senate where they see his rising power. Or maybe it's not Caesar. It might be someone way, way earlier. So I won't say it was Caesar. But there was this one instance of lawfare in ancient Rome where essentially the Senate was negotiating with a rising star, whether it was Caesar or Marius or something. I can't remember specifically. But they tried to use a triumph as a political tool. They said, okay, we're not going to give you this, but we'll give you a triumph, right? Giving someone a triumph, which is essentially the celebration of a campaign victory, was a political tool to try to appease somebody's, other negotiations or things that they wanted, right? You appease them with a triumph, which is literally the most martial celebration that you can have. Which shows that it's all tied together. So Caesar's campaigns, having a successful campaign, extending the power of Rome, also extends his political power. And this is largely why the Senate is so fearful of him, is that he commanded so much political power because he had loyal legions, because he had the love of the people who benefited from the material of his campaigns, obviously, because increasing the power of Rome meant, the Roman economy was all hitched on expansion through warfare. In large part, this is why they fail later on when they stop expanding. But anyway, you're absolutely right with the political and the martial being tied into each other. I think that goes without saying. But there's another great quote that you had that I'll mention soon. I believe it is in chapter 21, so it's a little bit in the future. So I'm just going to turn my page to that really quick. And I mentioned this quote in a little short that I did on my channel, but I'll just read it out for the legionaries quickly. It is on page 87. War is one of those phenomena that distills the nature of life down to its most pure and naked forms. Life is, at base, an arena of competing wills, chaos, and truth revealed by action. In war, as it is in life generally, material circumstances are variable. Supplies are used or lost. Technology works under circumstance. The fog of war throws into doubt the caprice of the moment, and men die at the whim of luck just as often as they are preserved by their own valor. In this chaotic environment, warriors sup from the cup of conquest if they can adhere to the maxims of discipline, regardless of the circumstances at every moment. So the first half of that quote is obviously more important to what we're talking about now. But seeing life in all facets as essentially an extension of war and distilling everything to war illuminates the reality of things in a way that you can start to orient yourself properly, which I think is really pertinent and important today. Because at the end of the day, if you think about what is the legitimacy, quote unquote, of leftist power, it's completely illegitimate when you distill it. Because take their views of health, for instance, right? They say, oh, well, health experts recommend you get this vaccine, or health experts say that actually working out and bodybuilding is bad for you. Health experts say this and that. You need this medication. Where is the legitimacy of these health experts? Well, the reality is that their quote unquote legitimacy comes from these false institutions, which are paying, like you think about pharmaceutical companies, all these pharmaceutical companies are paying quote unquote doctors and scientists or whatever to say that their pharmaceutical brand is good. They pay them money. It's all a business. The same with why I don't trust generals these days is because as soon as they retire, what do? They are bought out by the military-industrial complex. And the military-industrial complex does not always have the best interest of the country, because their goal is to sell more munitions and jets and tanks and whatnot. So, of course, when the Marine Corps rightly decided to downsize and get rid of tanks because it didn't make sense for Force Design 2022 or whenever the hell it happened, because we were preparing for war in the Pacific where tanks aren't going to be as important. Of course, all these generals wrote out in protest because they're all owned by the MIC. But the reason I mention this is leftist power ultimately resides on this false legitimacy imparted upon them by institutions. And what are institutions without the military backing, right? They're nothing. Because ultimately, what is anything without the backing of violence? Nothing. But we give this false perception in liberal modernity that, oh, actually, we don't need violence anymore. We can settle things diplomatically. But ultimately, all diplomacy for most of human history, until it's been subverted in modernity, has been the diplomacy of, okay, we are about equal in force of arms, so we are going to negotiate, right? It was always this backing of violence. Or alternatively, we may be weaker than you, but if you come into our country, you're going to lose more people than you will gain from conquering us. So, for example, you might see this in Afghanistan. Like, really, what is the reason for invading Afghanistan? There isn't really much of a reason, because we're going to lose more people than we're going to gain from it, right? And that was what diplomacy was. And this is why leftist, will to power is all false, because it's not built on anything real. When leftists lose an election, they say, oh, actually, it's because the American people are wrong. Okay, well, that makes no sense, right? What makes you right? So anyway, I just wanted to point to that, because when you say that quote, I mean, in the previous chapter as well, it really hits the nail on the head on why we are right and why our enemies are incorrect. And of course, we're not nihilist, right? We don't believe in this nihilistic expression of power. We believe in beauty, but we believe in beauty because it is an aesthetic of power. It is an aesthetic of violence, right? Why is the lion beautiful? Why is the tiger beautiful? Why is the eagle beautiful? Well, it's not because of this sort of random, mix of colors that make it beautiful. And that's part of it, obviously, but it's because of the violence attached to these things. That's why we find a lion beautiful, because of power, right? So power and beauty are all attached. Violence, power, and beauty. So I really like that, and maybe you have some things to say about that as well, I'm sure.
Yeah, I do. I mean, I completely agree with you. And a lot of people, I mean, I don't even care for these people's opinions because they're just wrong and they're just incorrect. But they say that, oh, war has nothing to do with anything else outside a very narrow definition of war is. And that's completely false, right? Because war isn't just about two groups of men charging at each other with either swords or freaking rifles or whatever. That's not what the point is. What is war if not at base the contest of willpower? Your mind is conquered by basically what is considered to be information warfare. And I hope that many of you have been paying attention the last 10 years as to the flimsiness and the fickleness of what truth is, quote unquote, truth, right? And that ultimately truth is whatever gives your conviction the most strength. And you're absolutely right, warrior. Like, there is an absolute truth, but this truth comes a lot more brutally and more how do you say, ruthlessly than a lot of people are willing to give it credit for. And that ultimately the reason why we have become so weak is because we have chosen to forget these cold and uncomfortable truths. in place of fairy tales, a place of very nice fairy tales, which ultimately, I don't know, they weaken us time after time, and which is why I have such a strong conviction against Christianity and its subsequent inheritors in liberalism and all concepts that believe that man is inherently good and that ultimately the aim of life is peace and prosperity and brotherhood. Well, my friend, Rome was born in brotherhood. That is to say, in fratricide. Remember that Romulus killed Remus, and that ultimately the greatest things happen due to conflict and war, and that ultimately it's adversity which is good, and that peace is itself a concept of death. And I know this sounds kind of over the top, but I think it's important because there are so many cowardices, especially small cowardices, that we allow ourselves and that we cling on to because they form a necessary crutch over time. And I'm here to kick out that crutch from under you because you're not an old man. You're a young man, and you've allowed yourself to believe that you have this crippling, weak soul that needs to be couched in this kind of language as if you need it. You don't need it. And I'm here to give you strength. And this is part of why my book is, if I may be so bold to say, so important and why you should read it. But Warrior, I hope this was. I know I kind of went off center again, but it's like you say, so many people they hide their weakness behind words of strength, but it's really not the case ever. You know.
And long story short, what Lance is trying to do right now is justify when he kills me in the future. No, I'm kidding. But no, I actually, funny enough, there's one of our most loyal fans, Brian Utility, who comments on most of our videos a lot. He made a joke once asking if we were gonna kill each other, Romulus and Remus style, which was pretty funny. But anyway,
well, it would be an honor. It'd be an honor because
it's okay.
I wouldn't want to be killed by one of these cockroaches. So,
well, you know? It's okay, Lance. I take after Mishima a lot, so you know, I'll sooner kill myself before I kill my brother. But
same,
no,
bro.
but
I love you, brother. I love you, brother.
Yes, it's all love here, Legionaries. Don't worry, Lance and I will not kill each other. And besides, I'm a little bit younger than Lance, so I'll just take over after he grows old and dies. It'll be peaceful transfer of power. No, but anyway, I would go more into Alesia, but I'd rather let the reader. I mean, I don't want to, because I've gone over a lot of parts of the book. I don't want to read
don't give
too
away
much,
too much.
You know?
Yeah,
exactly. I'd like to allow the reader to purchase the book, of course, and read it themselves, and you know, learn for themselves these things. I don't want to give up away too much, so I think we'll sort of start to wrap things up there. I think we went over the good parts, right? But we also left a lot of good parts for the reader themselves to discover them themselves. So before we wrap things up, is there any last sort of message you have for the Legionaries?
Yes, absolutely. I think ultimately, if you could take one thing from all of this, from the book, from, you know, the exhortations that I'm making, is that the life, everything that you ever wanted is just on the other side of pain. And the mountains that you want to see summited are brought to you by the processes which you're trying to constantly avoid. Run towards pain. Run towards pain. And I promise you, this life will be made yours. And that's all I have to say for that. Thank you, Warrior. I really do appreciate you having me on.
Of course. And Legionaries, there'll be a link to the book in the description, comments, all that stuff. I recommend you purchase the book, and Lance and I will actually be working together for the future of DVX Publishing. So I'm going to be joining the team officially. So by purchasing a book, you're also supporting me. So do that.
That's right.
Buy our books, buy all our books. We have lots of books on the website, not just original works, but also other works of great men in the future. Of course, we have Edward Gibbon's book that just got published, and of course this is a reprint, but it's a very nice reprint. It's a great cover, great design. Sometimes with these reprints, you get this very bland, boring sort of thing. But this, when you pick up this book, this is something you're going to want to show your friends. It's a beautiful design, beautiful interior. So you're really going to feel invigorated when you read it. So I recommend you pick up a copy of that. It's a hardcover, so it's definitely something that you'll feel proud of owning. But besides that, I know I haven't published a video in a while, but I'm actually going to be moving to a new place soon, and I'm going to be able to start doing video podcasts again. I'm going to have my own office space, and I'm going to decorate it with lots of dissident right-wing flags and whatnot. So that's going to be great. Lots of posters. And it's going to be a great time. But lots of exciting things are coming up soon, which Lance and I will announce in the near future. But other than that, thank you, Legionaries, as always, for supporting the work we do. And I have nothing else to say other than thank you, General Lance, for joining, and Legionaries, thank you for joining. And as always, this is the Warrior Philosopher, building foundations of the Warrior Philosophy, and New Rome is coming. We have been a little bit slow recently. I think a lot of us have busy stuff going on in our lives as of late, but we've not forgotten the project. We are still working adamantly to bring it to fruition. So
forever.
Do not despair. Exactly. This is an eternal project. If Lance and I fall, we expect that you guys will continue the mission. But thank you for joining, and I'm signing out now to go slaughter my enemies. So well, seize the day.
The future belongs to us.
Absolutely. Absolutely. All right, Legionaries, signing off. Ave Caesar, Ave Rome, go by Caesar Bellator.